Great. Yeah? We're live. Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming out in the rain. It's a big deal. Appreciate it. I want to acknowledge that. So let's continue. This week, we're going to be finishing up with chapter 13. And
I think you should turn it towards you. No, I think it's fine. Yeah, it's fine.
do you see me in the screen?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Unless you want to be seen in the screen.
No.
That's fine with me, as long as you can hear me. It's perfect. Okay, so this week we are finishing up with chapter 13, and we are, God willing, going to be diving into chapter 14. So just to give a quick review of what we were doing in chapter 13. Actually, let's just go back for a moment. Chapter 10, we spoke about the Russia. Chapter 11, we spoke about the Tzaddik. Chapter 12, we finally got into what is a Beinoni. So remember that the Alter Rebbe has been building the Tanya with so much intention. There's a famous story of the Alter Rebbe spending 3 weeks on just considering whether or not he should use the letter Vav. And Vav, we know, is a letter that is kind of thrown around. It's just kind of one of those like extra letters. And the Alter Rebbe put so much intense intention into every single letter that he put in the Tanya. So the way that he built up the chapters is also laying the foundation for what he deeply wants us to understand in the progression of processing what a Beinoni is. The whole Sefer is supposed to be about what is a Beinoni, how to live as a Beinoni. And so up until now, we've been building to that moment, describing what a Russia is, what a Tzaddik is, and finally, Perek Beis, we spoke about what is a Beinoni. Now we're going to have a deepening of what a Beinoni is and what the Beinoni's experience is. And kind of what we were speaking about last week is going back to the very first chapters and answering the questions that we had at the very beginning, answering those questions because now we have the knowledge to more deeply understand the answers to those questions, and then again dive into a deepening of what a Beinoni is. So just a quick review of some of those questions. If you'll remember, the questions were, what actually is the definition of a tzaddik and a rasha? What is the definition of a Beinoni? We know the way the Gemara sees it. We know the way that Kabbalah sees it. What is it truly? What is it really? And with our understanding now, we understand that a tzaddik is someone who lives an inspired life. He is constantly inspired. He doesn't sin because he's living on a different plane. He's on a different entire wavelength than the standard, the Beinoni. What is a rasha? A rasha is a person who's compromised. He is non-inspired. He has lost the inspiration and his ability to even make decisions according to the Nefesh Elokis within him has been compromised. His city has been overtaken, and now he has engaged in sin. The Beinoni is the person who is not inspired, but he is not compromised either. He has both of those voices raging in his heart and in his mind constantly. He hears the Nefesh Elokis, he hears the Nefesh Bahamis. He hears both of them constantly, but his decision-making and his actions in his levushim, right? So his thought, speech, and action, he expresses himself as righteous, right? So he's not compromised, but within, he is constantly in a state of flux. He is always battling himself. And we gave those examples of the wealthy man versus the poor man and how he built up the fire in his home. And we spoke about what is the fire in this mashal? And the nimshal is as davening and Shabbos, where when we engage in tefillah, we're deeply connecting with a part of ourselves, with our neshama, our essence, that helps us realign ourselves with Hashem and who we are. And we're supposed to be able to take that and like kind of drag it into or bring it into the rest of our day so that we could live in a state of Beinoni. When we're davening, we're a complete Beinoni. We are fully not compromised. We're even feeling inspired. A Beinoni is feeling inspired when he's davening, but the rest of his life or the rest of his day-to-day is not experiencing that inspiration unless he's able to bring it moment by moment into his world. So what were the answers to those questions? Now that we understand what a tzaddik and a rasha is, when it says that you should look at yourself as a rasha, the Alter Rebbe says it doesn't say look at yourself as an actual rasha. It says kir rasha. which means you should always look at yourself as someone who has the potential to sin, right? You could look at yourself as I am a Beinoni, but I should look at myself as Kirasha, as someone who could fall into sin. And that's a completely fine way to look at yourself, and that's not disheartening. That's just kind of basically keeping your ego in check. And the other question where we were trying to understand, how could Rabbah look at himself as a tzaddik? The answer to that was, well, it's very easy for Rabbah to make that mistake. He was living a constant, inspired lifestyle. He was always learning Torah. If he's learning Torah constantly, he never was able to make a mistake and live anything other than an uncompromised life. He was always busy with Torah learning, so he could have looked at himself as a Beinoni because he was always engaged, always inspired. The mistake he made was realizing that he actually had the neshama of a tzaddik. But yes, he looked at himself as a Beinoni. Why? Because he was living that actual inspired lifestyle, but he thought maybe it was just because I'm always learning Torah, so therefore my Nefesh Bahamas didn't have a voice to take over. Of course he wasn't. Of course he was a true tzaddik. So we're walking away with a deep understanding that a Beinoni is someone who is not inspired only at certain points, and he is always vulnerable. That being said, there's looking at myself as the ideal Beinoni, right? The ideal Beinoni is someone who doesn't sin, hasn't sinned, isn't going to sin, but he has the opportunity and the struggle of someone who could sin. And then there's also like Madrigas HaBeinoni, which is the Alter Rebbe's way of describing someone who is constantly trying to achieve the Madriga of what a Beinoni is. Okay? Again, it's very important to remember that the Alter Rebbe says it's so not relevant to put yourself in a box. It's so not relevant to say to look for perfection or to put a boundary or limitation on yourself, because as soon as you start doing that, then you're not letting yourself move forward. You're limited to the plateau that you have striven to get to, or you see yourself as. It's not important to say, this is who I am. What's more important is to make progress. So here the Alter Rebbe, again, so in tune with our humanness and who we really are, says, let's call this Madrigas HaBeinoni. What does that mean? It means you're striving constantly towards becoming a Beinoni, to the level of a Beinoni. That person who is trying to be inspired, is davening, trying to bring that into his day, and is not compromising in any which way. And how do I do that? How do I achieve the Madrigas HaBeinoni? It's like an actionable Beinoni, someone who takes actionable goals to achieve this level of Beinoni. So that person, like what we were speaking about last time, that person who says, I can do this for 5 minutes. For 5 minutes, I could sit in a class and it not be about my ego, and it be perfectly about God and me and my Nefesh Elokis in tune with the material and me being present to that, and not being caught up with my Nefesh Bahamas and my desires and everything else that's making me want to do an Avera. I could do that for 5 minutes. That is available to me. And the Alter Rebbe says our life is made up of those moments. And if we could do it for one moment, we could do it for another moment and add those up. There's a really incredible story of Reb Mendel Futterfass, who was a chassid, who spent 10 years in the Gulag. And it was very intense. He basically was with a bunch of prisoners, people who had done terrible things, and he lived with them side by side, same cell. And one of the ways he describes how he survived that experience was every single thing that he experienced, every story he heard, every person he met, he tried to find a lesson in Avodas Hashem. Now, this is a separate story. One day he was assigned guard duty on a frigid night. And that basically was a death sentence, because he had to stay in one place. And you can't move, you just have to be watching. And if it's that freezing cold, it's very easy to just succumb to the cold. And it's, the most pleasurable death a person can experience, where it's just, this basically the way people describe it is there's suddenly like a warm glow. And a person basically falls asleep and never wakes up. Chas v'shalom, it shouldn't happen to anybody. So he knew that this was going to happen if he wasn't vigilant. But how is he supposed to survive? He has to stay in one place. And it was freezing. So he decided to do was, he knew that that warm glow would come. That warm glow just like welcoming him, beckoning to him. And he knew that if he could just take 5 minutes of concentrating on not giving into that warm feeling or falling asleep, then he would survive those 5 minutes. And he basically spent 5 minutes by 5 minutes the entire night. And this concept that we're learning about in the Tanya saved his life, where he just said, I'm going to just concentrate for the next 5 minutes staying alive. And that's what he did. And every 5 minutes, he just took the struggle on again. And that's the way that he was able to not get pulled in to falling asleep or to that warm glow that was so easy to fall into. Now, the example here is so incredible, right? That story is so relevant. How often do we feel like it's just so much easier and so much more comfortable to go with this, right? So if someone's saying something to you, someone's saying Lashon Hara, and you know that it's not the right thing, but you're just gonna just go with it because it's just comfortable. Or you find yourself being critical of someone, and a part of you is like, wow, you're so judgmental. And then another part of you is, but then again, I see it, and it's true, and it's just, let me go with this. Because it's so much harder to reach for compassion or to reset yourself and say, hey, I should really look at this person with a different point of view. That willpower, that self-control is what kept Reb Mendel Futterfass alive. And if we were to really look at every part of our life as, if I'm connecting myself to Hashem, then I'm reaching for life. And every time I disconnect from Hashem, I am succumbing to maves, to lack of life, then we would be able to tap into the way Reb Mendel Futterfass was actually surviving the night. But we don't, right? We don't have that intense awareness that Hashem is keeping us alive at every given moment. Every single time we get in tune with our Nefesh Elokis and connecting ourselves to spirituality, that's what keeps us alive. And when we connect ourselves to things that are other, then that's experiencing other than God, other than life, other than Chayim. And we're experiencing maves. We don't have that intense reality. We're not living with that at every moment. But we could, right? We could bring that concept a little bit into our life and say, hey, if I connect for 5 minutes with Chayim, 5 minutes with God, then I'm choosing life over lack of life. Key is, and this is the beginning of chapter 14, is not lying to ourselves. And we're doing this constantly, right? Because the life that we live is an alma de shikra. The life, everything that we see with our physical eyes is lack of God. It's otherness. And we're supposed to be able to see that in order to overcome it, but it's so challenging because every aspect of our human interaction with the world, with ourselves, with other people is always coming through this prism of humanness and otherness. However, the Alter Rebbe here starts talking about what is the concept of real truth. You know, people always say that religious people are hypocritical because they see them like cutting the line or they see them trying to get the best deal, and they expect that a person who lives the life of the chosen people, right, or lives a life of godliness, they should be basically perfect. And if you're not, then you're hypocritical. And it's a pretty intense one to see. Personally, I was watching some of the rally, I don't know what, the march yesterday. I don't know if any of you watched it, but there was a pastor who got up and he spoke for 10 minutes, and he spoke really passionately about how Bnei Yisrael are the chosen people. And with so much admiration and with so much admiration, really, for us, for the chosen people. And what came up for me was, wow, this person really sees us, sees who we are. And the other aspect that came up was also what he spoke about, was that Bnei Yisrael are the concept of like the city on the hill, where the rest of the nations look up to us and they say, This is what we are supposed to look up to and try to emulate. We are the nation on the hill. And it's a responsibility. And sometimes the responsibility is very heavy. And it's too much to be perfect. And here the Alter Rebbe is saying, stop thinking that you have to be perfect. Don't lie to yourself that you could even ever be perfect, but at least try for the next 5 minutes to do the next right thing. Right? If we get caught up in ourselves, in our ego, listen to the Yetzer who's demanding perfection, then we're just going to start drowning. And yes, we will live a life that is hypocritical. As opposed to, if I could just align myself with, I want to do what's right, I deeply care with connecting to Hashem, connecting with His will, and I will try to do so in the next 5 minutes. Then the Alter Rebbe is saying in a very, very human, relatable way, you are achieving what you are supposed to be doing. You are supposed to be engaging in like the Avodah of a Beinoni. That's the Avodah of a Beinoni. That's Madregas of Beinoni. Actionable, tangible moves forward or toward becoming a Beinoni. Now, the Alter Rebbe starts talking about MS, and he brings up this question of what is the truth. In the beginning, the very first classes that we had, we spoke about what is true MS. And the Alter Rebbe says, I don't want to hear about all the different labels that we have of good and bad and evil. The only thing that is absolute goodness is God. Everything else is otherness. That is the one MS. And so when the Alter Rebbe approaches Tanya and he gives us kind of an understanding of what really is this world, he says there's only one truth. And there also are levels of truth. And here the Alter Rebbe brings up and he says, what is a Beinoni? Is a Beinoni an absolute hypocrite? He's in a constant state of flux. And this is not something that fluctuates. It's steady, it's true, it's calm, it doesn't waver. That's what MS is supposed to be. When you look at an MSic person, what makes you feel like this person is deeply, truly living by their ideals and their values when you see that they stick to it. If you see them fluctuating or succumbing, then you don't think of them as someone who's deeply MSic and really living by their ideals and values. So the Alter Rebbe says, how are we supposed to look at this Beinoni? If the very definition of a Beinoni is flux, then that probably means that he's just not MS. And here in chapter 14 is the one place where the Alter Rebbe speaks in the first person. And he says, I believe. All throughout the rest of the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe professes, and he even writes in the first page, he says, all of what I'm going to teach you comes from my predecessors, comes from these Sfarim, comes from my teachers. Here is the one place where the Alter Rebbe, it's just very interesting, it's the one place throughout the entire Tanya that the Alter Rebbe says, I think, it is of my opinion, that he says that the Beinoni is a person of MS. And he gives 2 reasons why. He says, I think that a Beinoni is MSic, and I think that you should look at yourself as someone who is MSic. And the reason for this is because his actions have consistency. Even if inside there's turmoil, but his actions are consistent. His devotion, his thought, speech, and action, the way he expresses himself, the way he interacts with his world, that is consistent. And because of that, there's a level of MS there. I wouldn't call him a hypocrite. I would say there's a madrega of MS there, and he should look at himself as MS. And the other reason why he says that, in his own opinion, that this is MSic, is because at any given moment throughout a Beinoni's day, even if he's not feeling inspired, he always could go right back to it. He just has to open up a sefer. He has to start learning. He has to start davening. He has to channel some Shabbos into his world. But he could reach for the MS. He could reach for that inspired experience. And if he does that, he's back to where he should be. So the fact that it's so available to him, that it's ever in the potential for him, shows on his MS. It's there. It's latent. And because of that, he shouldn't be considered someone who's hypocritical. Just because he's in a state of flux and he's a struggler doesn't mean that he is not emes. He is emes because his actions are constant and consistent, and the availability of the inspiration for him is right there. And it's in potential constantly. He can turn to it at any given moment of the day. And if you think about it, it's such an inspiring thing, right? If you just say for yourself, just as a person, a very human experience, you're in your car and you're not feeling inspired, you're feeling a sense of despair with everything that's going on right now. And it's so easy to start drowning in it and to feel like I'm not connected to the Eibishter. I'm not feeling the Emunah B'tachon that I want to be feeling. And all you have to do is just open up a siddur, open up a Tehillim, and put yourself back into that space. I was speaking to someone today. It was so beautiful. I wish I could tell you who it is. But I don't have that permission, but I'll still share this story. So I know this person very well, and she says a lot of Tehillim. A lot of Tehillim. And Tehillim has not always been easy for her, but she says it often. And she was sharing with me how she was going through just a busy day. And there was going to be a lot of details to handle and a lot of physical labor and just like stress. And she was worried about it. And she was trying to plan it out so that it would all work out easily and smoothly. And after it all worked out, Baruch Hashem, she shared with me how she was saying the words of Tehillim, whatever she knew by heart, throughout. And it was such a source of comfort for her throughout the struggle. To me, that's a Beinoni moment, right? That's a Beinoni just naturally tapping into her ability to be inspired. What makes me feel inspired? What makes me feel connected? What brings me back to my alignments with the Eibishter? For her, it's Tehillim. So she did that. She brought herself back, and it carried her throughout the entire day. And that's literally what the Alter Rebbe is talking about here. So a person who does something like that, Chas v'shalom to say that she's hypocritical, that's so emastic. It was available to her, and she brought it back into her day-to-day living with the dumb details that we live with, the minor and materialistic details that we have to grapple with all the time. And that's literally what she was grappling with. It was like schleppy and stressful and timing and all those limitations of a physical world. And she saw it, and she saw that it was stressful. And instead of getting harried and annoyed and getting thrown by all of it, she just carried herself calmly with the words of Tehillim. How beautiful is that? No one would look at this person and say she's a tzaddikas by any means, but she was able to tap into Madrigas Beinoni. Beautiful. So here the Alter Rebbe now brings in one of the first words of the Tanya, where the Alter Rebbe quotes a Gemara that says, "Tihi tzaddik v'al tihi rasha." And the question there was, what does that even mean? First of all, it sounds like the same, like a double negative, like it's the same thing. Tihi rasha, be righteous, and don't be a sinner. Don't be a rasha. Isn't that the same thing? Why are you saying the same thing twice? And the other question is, how could you make me promise to do something like that when I haven't even gotten to the world yet? Right? That's what the soul is enjoined to do before it comes to this world. And what the Alter Rebbe answers is, now with this deep understanding of a tzaddik who lives an inspired lifestyle all the time, and a rasha who has been compromised and does sin, the understanding is, tihi tzaddik. Don't be a tzaddik, but behave like a tzaddik. Allow yourself to be inspired. You know what gets you to feel inspired and connected to Hashem. That could be unique for you. The way the Alter Rebbe explains it here is davening, but davening is very unique to every single person. What does davening look like to you? Sometimes people do tzedakah and they daven while they're doing tzedakah. That's their just time to talk to Hashem and relate to Hashem. And it doesn't look standard. It's not typical Shacharis and Chomerev. Some people just daven to themselves in the car. I remember speaking to a woman and she said, I don't manage to daven every day. It's very hard for me. I feel bad. But she says, I talk to Hashem all the time though. And I thought, wow, meaning that's almost like you're davening all the time because you're just speaking to him like he's available and there for you always. That's her living her inspiration. She's bringing that inspired feeling into her day-to-day life. She's sitting in a car, driving carpool, picking up from the market, but she's davening. What does it mean, Pa'al Tihi Rasha? We're saying don't be compromised, right? Don't give sway to the city. You're not a Rasha. Don't think of yourself as a Rasha, but know that you have the potential to maybe sin. So stay squarely in the middle. Try to be inspired and at the same time hate sin. And here the Alter Rebbe starts talking about what a tzaddik is, right? Where a tzaddik deeply despises anything other than God. And he says that if you're trying to be inspired sometimes, like a tzaddik always does, you could also try the other side, which is to also hate sin. And what does that look like? That looks like deeply not identifying with anything other than Hashem. And you can't do that all the time because you're not a tzaddik. But just like you're dragging that inspiration from davening in the morning to the rest of your day, maybe it's possible for you to also garner a dislike for a sin, right? Even if you're not a tzaddik, you can behave like a tzaddik or pretend to be like a tzaddik and bring some of the inspired experience of a tzaddik into your regular Beinoni struggle life. So after we try, and after we try to be inspired and we try to hate sin and we're not giving sway to the struggle within ourselves, what happens then? What if we still are falling? The Alter Rebbe then speaks about something called fooling ourselves. And he says, it's so easy for us to look at parts of our lives and say, I'm still a good Jew. Like, I do this and this and this, and I'm a good Jew. And at the same time, still engage in sinning. And here the Alter Rebbe uses very strong language, and he says, don't fool yourself into thinking that no matter what, you're a good Jew. No matter what, you are a good Jew. But you can't think of yourself and say, if I'm doing this sin, that I'm not distancing or disconnecting myself from godliness. Even in the midst of doing that, of course, you're still a good Jew. Of course, Hashem still loves you. But don't say that this sin is not going to detach me from God. Share with you like a simple example. Women will sometimes ask me, is it okay for me to say this and this to my husband? Is it okay for me to, just take charge? Let's say I'm teaching a woman to not be seeking grounding through her husband, right? So if she is feeling stressed about finances, and she'll bring that stress to her husband and say, what have you done today to raise money for our shul? What have you done today? Like, have you spoken to this and this broker? Have you met with this and this person? And basically she's very concerned. So she's bringing her fears to her husband, and she's trying to ground herself by getting him to work harder, right? So a woman will ask me, she'll say, but I really am afraid, and I really do need the answers, and I do need to ask him this question. And I always say, listen, you could do whatever you want. It's your choice, it's your life. But let's not pretend and say that if you try to control your husband's day and how hard he's working, that it's not going to create a level of disconnect in your relationship. If a woman is trying to control her husband, it will create disconnect. Let's not lie and say, okay, everything is completely fine and our connection is going to be great no matter what I do. I know for myself, if someone is disrespectful to me, it does put a sort of detachment in the relationship. I could get over it in a few minutes. I could come back to where we were, the next day. But I'm not going to say that for a moment I didn't experience disconnect. Of course we do, right? So here the Alter Rebbe says, what happens? We experience a ruach shtus, a spirit of folly, where we delude ourselves. We think, okay, so I can engage in this kind of behavior and it's not going to actually affect me. I'm still connected to Hashem. This is not going to be the one thing that delineates what my connection is with Hashem. And so that Ruach just takes over. And we engage in that behavior. Now listen, if it's happening only once in a lifetime, it's forgivable. But if that Ruach Shtos keeps on coming in again and again and again, and we start deluding ourselves more and more and more, what starts happening is we're living in delusion as opposed to living in the inspiration that we're supposed to be living in. So we're making excuses for ourselves because we love that. We love to be comfortable, and we don't want to hurt ourselves. So we don't want to look at ourselves as anything less than, and that's important. And we love to protect ourselves, and that's good. These are good things. Hashem built us to be like that. And at the same time, MS is truth, right? We have to be living our lives according to that level of MS. And like the Alter Rebbe says, there's levels and layers of MS. And the more that I could uncover those layers of MS and tell myself, okay, I know that this behavior is not absolute truth. It's not connecting me to Hashem. If I could even just admit that, what might happen is less of a desire to engage with that behavior. More of this potential to hate that behavior, right? Channeling the tzaddik into your experience. Normally, we don't hate sins. We're not a tzaddik. We don't feel that way with otherness than God. But if we could at least be aware and truthful to what the real experience is, a disconnect with God when we engage with a certain avera, then at least I'm letting myself know that this is what's happening. Now, the real pits is when we experience a level of not even caring. Right? The worst experience is when we feel the Amalek. The Amalek, the famous example in the Tanakh is when Bnei Yisrael came out of Mitzrayim, and everyone was in absolute fear of the Jews. No one even thought of breathing in their direction. And then Amalek came and attacked the Yidden. And Rashi gives that famous example of a person jumping into the bath, and immediately the bath cools, right? So what happened was there was like a cooling effect. Not everyone was living in the same amount of fear of the Jews. And what Amalek brought was this a level of nonchalance, a level of disconnected emotion towards Bnei Yisrael. The word would be, what's a good word for that? Just not caring, being numb to the experience. And if we have reached that level, then that's really a not good place to be in. And when we do, and we recognize that that's a part of what we're experiencing, we're not just experiencing a ruach shus that's overtaking us, and we could kind of redirect ourselves back to what we really want to be, is connecting to Hashem and not desiring to not connect with Him. But if we're experiencing that numbness and that feeling of distance and disconnect to, then, right, that nonchalance, then we have to reach much deeper. We have to open ourselves up to Hashem interfering and saying, this is now a time for me to surrender completely to Hashem, and Hashem is going to help me come out of this. If I'm at a place of experiencing a level of indifference, like the indifference of Amalek towards this sin, or like an ambivalence towards my connection with God, and not seeing that this deep disconnect that I'm experiencing when I engage with this avera, it doesn't really weigh in for me enough to stop engaging with it, then that's, I could relate to this myself as an all-time low. I'm just thinking of my own sins, or my own indifference. And that's when we really have to dive into Hashem to remove that Amalek, to remove that indifference, and to allow us to care again. And I mean, just like an interesting story to connect this with. So when the Alter Rebbe went to prison, he was in prison for, I believe it was 53 days. And while he was in prison, there were a series of courts, a series of him needing to attend court and kind of justify all the allegations against him. So there were a bunch of allegations listed by, doesn't matter who, a certain Rav, who was feeding the Russian government all of the complaints that he had against the Alter Rebbe, some of which were sending tzedakah to Eretz Yisrael, which he told them was the Alter Rebbe supporting the government of Eretz Yisrael, which at the time was enemies with Russia, the Turkish Empire. And another thing that he had against him was the way that the Alter Rebbe davens like the Baal Shem Tov, right? So the Alter Rebbe was a student of the Baal Shem Tov, almost spiritual grandchild of the Baal Shem Tov. And it was known that the Baal Shem Tov, when he would daven, in the midst of it all, he would say, af, this word, af. And this Rav was telling the Russian government, af in Hebrew means anger. And what the Baal Shem Tov was trying to do was incite anger against the Russian government. Now, really, that was obviously not at all what the Baal Shem Tov was doing, and it's not important, like, I don't even want to get into it, what the mystical explanations for what the Baal Shem Tov was actually doing when he was saying that. But the point of the story is that the Alter Rebbe, when he was told this, how could you be a follower of someone who is inciting anger against the government? He could have very easily said, oh, it was nothing, it was just the way that the Baal Shem Tov spoke. He said, I could have gotten away with it. But for me, to look at myself and say that for a moment, I'm not connecting with the Baal Shem Tov, and to just kind of dismiss it and not be fully and entirely connected with the Baal Shem Tov and explain the deep mystical reasons why he was engaging with that behavior, I couldn't do it. So he explains to all these Russian non-Jews all the deep mystical explanations for why the Baal Shem Tov was davening in that way. He didn't have to, right? He could have just said, oh, it's just the way that the Baal Shem Tov speaks and davens. But to him, that felt like a disconnect from his spiritual grandfather. And he didn't even want for a moment to not be absolutely truthful and sever that connection that he had with the Baal Shem Tov. So it's just a beautiful story of the way that the Alter Rebbe looked at the Baal Shem Tov and deeply saw that by connecting himself with the Baal Shem Tov, connecting himself with someone that he believed lived an absolutely godly lifestyle, he couldn't disconnect himself from that even just for a moment. There's another story of Reb Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, who was very close with the Alter Rebbe. When the Alter Rebbe was writing the Tanya and he sent out his draft, he sent it with someone to different places, and he told him, don't go to Berdichev. I don't want Reb Levi Yitzchak Berdichev seeing the Tanya, because the Reb Levi Yitzchak didn't like something about the Tanya. And of course, it was Ashgacha Pratis. Somehow this man got derailed somehow from the route that he took, and he ended up in Berdichev, and immediately Reb Levi Yitzchak Berdichev sends one of his Talmidim to find this man who just arrived in town and tell him that I know he has a package of something, I need to see it. And the man comes and he says, what do you have? I want to see it. I was like, no, I don't have anything. He says, no, I want to see it. And he looks at the Tanya and he literally opens up this draft, and every single page of the Tanya, he took it and he just went like this. He said, Licht. And he flipped the page and he went Licht. And he flipped the page. Licht means light. And Chas v'shalom to say that Reb Levi Yitzchak Berdichev didn't appreciate what the Alter Rebbe was doing with Sefer Shabbeinu. His problem with the Tanya was he was Reb Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, who saw every single yid as absolute pureness, and he saw them as not even having the ability to sin, and he didn't like that. The Alter Rebbe says that not everybody could be a tzaddik. Right? The Alter Rebbe says this is Sefer Shabbeinu. It's written for the Beinoni. It's written for the layman, for the struggler. And the Alter Rebbe had the stance that not everybody is able to achieve that level of spiritual closeness with God. And Reb Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, who was the absolute pioneer, defendant of Am Yisrael, couldn't stomach that. He just couldn't. So that was where he was coming from. But such a powerful, deep understanding coming from Reb Levi Yitzchak Berdichev of every single person's potential. So on the one hand, we hear the Alter Rebbe where he's saying, this is what you can do. I deeply know where you're coming from. I see you, and I know that you are still emes. You have the potential because you could create that consistency in your actions. It's available to you. At any given moment, you can draw that inspiration and bring it back into your life. You can behave and look outwardly like a tzaddik. Really, you're a Beinoni, and outwardly you could behave like a tzaddik. And Rabbi Yitzchak Berdichev says, I really want everybody to be like that. It was just honestly two people looking at it from different viewpoints. But what's so beautiful is to deeply understand that the level of being a tzaddik is a gift. And that's really what the Alter Rebbe talks about at the ending of Perek Yudalid. To be a tzaddik is a gift. It's something that's given to you by the Eibishter. It's when Hashem says, now I'm ready to gather you in. You're ready to live on an even higher plane. Now, if that's not something that's available to you or me, what is available is to connect yourself with people who are already living on that plane. A person who is a tzaddik, who has achieved that level of spirituality, that deep, inherent, constant connection with God, not ever engaging with otherness than God. If I could connect with that person, surround myself with that person, align myself with that person, see their perspective, see the way that they engage with the world, maybe I could further my own avodah as a Beinoni and get closer to what the Alter Rebbe sees in me, someone who could achieve ideal Beinoni and not just Madrigas Beinoni, where I'm trying to actionably live the life of a Beinoni. So for me, the takeaway from Perek Yudalid is, how can I, first of all, engage more with the idea of bringing more inspiration and less of that identifying with a sin and deeply being emastic and truthful with myself, that if I'm engaging with that, it is disconnecting me from the Eibishter. And if I don't feel it, if I'm feeling numb, then maybe it's an opportunity for me to connect with a tzaddik, connect to someone who's on a higher level than me. Maybe it doesn't have to be a tzaddik. Maybe it's just someone who's a little bit higher than me who can bring me up sometimes. If I can't bring myself up with my davening, with my learning, maybe I just need a role model that could bring me to that space. What would it look like for me to engage more regularly with that role model? What would it look like for me to find someone that I deeply relate to and I feel like I could take on their perspectives and work from the outside in to change myself so that I am living more of a Beinoni life than the life of struggle that I'm experiencing all the time. So that's Perek Yudalid. And I just want to give us a bracha to maintain that level of calm and to bring a little more of that inspiration during this time. So
I just got a text. They found where the hostages are and are trying to rescue them. Please pass it on. And there's a bunch of Hebrew. So maybe you could say they found where the hostages are. Tova just texted me. They found out where they are. All of them? Well, it doesn't say all of them. It doesn't say all.